The 4 words that became basketball internet history. Before LaMelo Ball became an NBA superstar, before the All-Star selection, the massive contract, and the nightly highlights in Charlotte, he delivered one of the smoothest accidental rejections basketball internet had ever seen. No argument, no trash talk, no dramatic confrontation. Just Jaden Newman asking for an Instagram follow, and LaMelo calmly answering with 4 words that would follow both families for years. I don't run it. On the surface, it sounded harmless, almost reasonable, but the deeper you understand the history between the Ball and Newman families, the funnier and more awkward that moment becomes. At the time, youth basketball social media was obsessed with comparing LaMelo Ball and Julian Newman. Both had become viral sensations before most teenagers were even thinking about college. Julian built his reputation through flashy handles, deep shots, confidence, and highlight videos that generated millions of views. LaMelo had his own basketball circus surrounding him. Chino Hills, his brothers Lonzo and LiAngelo, LeVar Ball's nonstop promotion, and the growing big baller brand machine. They were young, they were famous, and the internet desperately wanted them to be rivals. So imagine Julian's perspective when his sister Jaden, herself already a recognizable basketball personality, walked over to LaMelo. The conversation initially looked completely normal. Jaden approached him, exchanged a few words, and eventually asked why he did not follow her back on Instagram. That was when LaMelo produced the line, "I don't run it." He did not say no. He did not insult her. He did not even really reject the request directly. He essentially claimed that the Instagram account carrying his own name was outside his jurisdiction, and somehow that made it 10 times funnier. The delivery was everything. LaMelo appeared relaxed, almost completely unaffected by the awkwardness of the situation. It felt less like a calculated joke and more like something that naturally came out of his personality. But the moment did not end there. Because cameras were rolling, Julian noticed what was happening. Jamie Newman had his own reaction. And years later, Jaden would add another wrinkle to the story by suggesting there was more behind the interaction than viewers originally realized. That is why this tiny exchange survived while thousands of other youth basketball clips disappeared. It was not simply about an Instagram follow. It combined 2 famous basketball families, an internet-created rivalry, sibling tension, reality show camera, and one perfectly delivered escape line. And the craziest part, the rivalry behind those 4 words had been building long before Jaden ever walked over to LaMelo. "Where are you watching from your city? State." Or country? If you think LaMelo's "I don't run it" was one of the smoothest responses possible, come on. If you think Jaden immediately knew she was getting curved, come on, do and subscribe. Because once you understand why LaMelo and Julian Newman were constantly compared, this moment becomes even more hilarious. Why LaMelo Ball and Julian Newman were always compared. Long before Jaden Newman walked up to LaMelo Ball and asked for an Instagram follow, the internet had already built a rivalry between LaMelo and Julian Newman, and that rivalry was almost unavoidable. Julian became famous incredibly young. While most kids his age were still learning how to survive organized basketball, he was already playing varsity competition, breaking defenders down off the dribble, pulling up from deep, and generating highlight clips that spread everywhere. He was small, fearless, flashy, and impossible to ignore. By middle school, he had already built a reputation as one of the most recognizable young basketball players in America. The attention came fast, so did the expectations. People started projecting his future years before his game had fully developed. Every new highlight became evidence that Julian might become something enormous. Every opponent became another chance to prove that the hype was real. Then LaMelo Ball entered the same internet ecosystem, but LaMelo's rise looked completely different. He had the Ball family machine behind him. Lonzo was becoming a national name. LiAngelo was part of the family basketball story, and LeVar Ball understood attention better than almost any sports parent of that era. By Bella Brand, television appearances, bold predictions, social media clips, everything around the family created noise. But LaMelo also had the game. As he grew, his combination of size, bossing, creativity, and confidence started separating him from ordinary youth prospects. He could make passes other teenagers did not even see. He played with a loose, almost casual rhythm that made difficult possessions look easy. That is why the comparison with Julian became irresistible. Both were famous, both were confident, both had fathers aggressively promoting the family brand, both had millions of people watching before either had proved anything professionally, but they represented two completely different basketball possibilities. Julian was the undersized, viral scoring guard. LaMelo was becoming the oversized playmaker with NBA-level physical tools. The internet did what the internet always does. It turned comparison into competition. Every tournament became evidence. Every highlight became an argument. Every bad game became ammunition. Neither teenager had to officially declare the other an enemy. The audience did that for them. And by the time the two families crossed paths regularly at major basketball events, that comparison had become part of their identities. That is what made Jaden's later interactions so much more than a random Instagram question, because she was not simply talking to another player, she was walking directly into a rivalry that thousands of fans had spent years building. Ball family versus Newman family, two brands fighting for attention. The LaMelo-Julian comparison was not happening in isolation. Behind both players were families that understood basketball fame could become something bigger than basketball. That is where the rivalry gained another layer. LeVar Ball did not treat his sons like ordinary prospects. He treated them like a brand before the traditional sports world was ready for it. Big Baller Brand became part basketball company, part family identity, and part media spectacle. LeVar made bold statements, challenged established names, and ensured that almost anything involving his sons became a national conversation. It was marketing through personality, and it worked. The Newman family was building its own ecosystem. Jamie Newman promoted Julian and Jaden through highlight footage, social media, appearances, and the Hello Newman's web series. Their basketball careers were not just games, they were serialized entertainment. Cameras followed the family. Personal conversations became content. Tournament weekends became episodes. That matters because it changed how ordinary interactions felt. When two basketball families are both competing for attention, audiences begin interpreting everything through that lens. Who had the better player? Who had the stronger brand? Who got more views? Who was actually destined for the NBA? That competitive energy did not necessarily mean the families hated each other, but it created an environment where even something as simple as Jaden talking to LaMelo could suddenly feel loaded. Jamie Newman's later reaction captured that perfectly from his perspective. Jaden approaching LaMelo after the families had spent so much time existing on opposite sides of the same youth basketball conversation was not just casual socializing, it was fraternizing with the enemy. That sounds dramatic. That is exactly why it became funny. Because these were still teenagers at a basketball tournament, but inside the world created around them, brand identity had become almost as serious as basketball identity. LaMelo represented the ball side, Julian represented the Newman side, and Jaden stepping across that invisible line became a miniature betrayal inside a rivalry that had been magnified by cameras and social media. That is what made the clip perfect. Content, you had teenage awkwardness, sibling tension, competing family brands, a famous basketball rival, and cameras already positioned to capture the entire thing. The interaction looked spontaneous. But as the story developed, that assumption became much less certain. Before we get to that twist, though, you have to understand something important about Jaden herself. She was never just Julian Newman's little sister. She already had an audience of her own. Jaden Newman was already a star of her own. It is easy to watch the viral clip years later and reduce Jaden Newman to one role, the girl who asked LaMelo Ball for a follow, but that completely misses who she was at the time. Jaden was already famous. She began playing varsity basketball at an age when most children were nowhere near that level of organized competition. Her basketball story was unusual from the beginning, and the attention followed quickly. She became known for scoring, for shooting, for confidence, for being another Newman child, doing things that looked almost impossible for someone so young. The source material highlights several moments that helped build her profile: huge scoring performances, national media attention, early recruiting interest, and a growing social media following. She was not standing behind Julian's career. She was building her own. That distinction makes the LaMelo interaction more interesting. Jaden was not an anonymous fan nervously walking up to an NBA prospect. She was a recognizable youth basketball personality approaching another recognizable youth basketball personality. Both had cameras around them. Both understood social media. Both existed inside families that had turned basketball into public entertainment. So when Jaden asked LaMelo to follow her back on Instagram, the request itself was not outrageous. If anything, it was completely normal for the environment they were in. Two teenage public figures. One asks for a follow. Simple. Except the answer was anything but normal. What made the moment so effective was that Jaden appeared to expect a straightforward social response. Maybe, yes, maybe later. Maybe a joke. Instead, LaMelo gave her a technical explanation. I don't run it. That line immediately shifted control of the conversation. Jaden had asked a normal question. LaMelo answered as though there were an invisible social media department somewhere responsible for his account. And because he delivered it without hesitation, the excuse almost worked for a second. That second is where the humor lives. Jaden's reaction showed she was trying to process whether he was serious. LaMelo stayed completely calm. No visible panic. No awkward backtracking. No explanation beyond what he had already said. That contrast turned the moment from ordinary into memorable, but what happened next made it legendary. Because Julian was close enough to learn exactly what his sister had done, and from his perspective, she had just walked directly into enemy territory. The Instagram question that changed everything. The setup could not have been simpler. Jaden walked over. LaMelo was there. The cameras were recording. The conversation started casually. Then she asked him to follow her on Instagram. That was it. No dramatic confession. No documented romantic proposition. No John confrontation. Just a social media request. And that detail matters because the internet later exaggerated the moment into something much bigger than what the source actually supports. What is documented is simpler. Jaden wanted a follow. LaMelo did not want to give her a direct yes. So he created an exit. I don't run it. The brilliance of the answer is that it shifted responsibility away from him. He was not saying, I don't want to follow you. He was essentially saying, this decision is not mine. That is what made it so smooth. It protected him from giving a direct rejection while also ending the conversation. For 1 second, the answer sounded plausible. Then you thought about it. LaMelo was a teenager with a huge social media presence. The idea that he had absolutely no control over his own account was ridiculous enough to be hilarious. Jaden seemed caught off guard by it. She asked a follow-up. LaMelo stayed committed, and that commitment was everything. A weaker response would have ruined the moment. If he had started laughing, the line might have felt like a joke. If he had explained too much, the excuse would have collapsed immediately. Instead, he delivered it like a fact. That deadpan confidence gave the phrase its power, and according to the source, later discussion suggested LaMelo actually did have control over his own account. If that is accurate, then the line was not confusion. It was improvisation. That makes the moment even funnier. He apparently invented a social excuse in real time, delivered it perfectly, and moved on. But the story still was not complete, because one side of the clip showed Jaden and LaMelo, the other side involved Julian and Jamie Newman, and their reaction turned a funny rejection into a family rivalry moment people would keep replaying for years. LaMelo's perfect escape line. There is a reason I don't run. It survived when thousands of other youth basketball clips disappeared. The line was useful. That sounds simple, but it is the secret behind many great memes. A viral moment lasts longer when people can take it out of the original context and reuse it in their own lives. LaMelo's answer became exactly that. Someone asks you to respond to a message, I don't run it. Someone wants access to something you control, I don't run it. Someone asks you for a favor you do not want to give, suddenly, responsibility belongs to some imaginary department. That is why the phrase became bigger than the tournament. It was not only funny because LaMelo said it, it was funny because everyone immediately understood the social strategy behind it. Do not say no directly. Create a technical barrier. Make the decision sound completely outside your control. Leave the conversation looking relaxed. That formula is universal, and it fits LaMelo's public personality almost perfectly. Even as a basketball player, he became known for improvisation, unexpected passes, creative finishes, casual-looking decisions that somehow work. The Instagram line felt like the off-court version of the same instinct. Someone gave him an awkward situation. He found an unconventional passing lane out of it. Whether the moment was entirely spontaneous or partially shaped by the cameras does not change how cleanly the response landed. That is what people remembered, and the more the clip circulated, the less its original basketball context mattered. Eventually, people did not need to know who Julian Newman was. They did not need to understand Hello Newman. They did not need to understand the rivalry. The line worked on its own, but if you did know the background, the clip became even funnier because LaMelo was not simply declining Jaden's request. Without realizing it, he was about to create a problem inside the Newman family. Julian had spent years being compared with LaMelo. Now his sister had just walked over to that exact player, and Jamie Newman had one unforgettable phrase for what he believed had happened, fraternizing with the enemy. Julian Newman felt betrayed. Julian Newman's reaction is where the entire story shifts from awkward teenage interaction to full family comedy. To understand why he cared, you have to remember what LaMelo represented to him. This was not just another kid from another team. LaMelo was the name Julian constantly saw next to his own. Who was better? Who had the brighter future? Who was actually an NBA prospect? Who was overrated? Who had the better highlights? The internet had been forcing Julian into that comparison for years. So when he learned his own sister had walked over to LaMelo after their basketball paths had crossed again, Julian did not process it as a meaningless Instagram interaction. He processed it through the rivalry. That is what made his frustration so funny. From the outside, Jaden had done almost nothing. From Julian's perspective, she had crossed a line. Jamie Newman amplified that feeling even more. His reaction from the family content became one of the most memorable pieces of the story. What's Jaden doing getting a picture with Melo? Then came the phrase, fraternizing with the enemy. That one line revealed just how seriously the family brand had absorbed the rivalry. LaMelo was not simply another teenager. He represented the competition. Big Bad Brand on one side, Prodigy Newman on the other. The idea of Jaden casually going over there suddenly looked almost like a brand violation. Julian later explained the emotional logic behind his response. He had just played LaMelo. He was constantly being compared with him. Then his sister immediately went over to interact with the same player. The timing bothered him, and even years later, when everyone involved could look back at the moment with more distance, Julian still remembered how strange it felt at the time. That is what makes the story human underneath the meme. Teenagers experience rivalries intensely, add millions of viewers. Family brands, constant social media comparison, and cameras documenting everything. And those emotions become magnified. Julian did not need LaMelo to be an actual enemy. The internet had already created that role, and his family had lived inside the narrative long enough that it began feeling real. But then came the detail that changed how people looked at the entire interaction. What if Jaden had not simply decided to walk over on her own? What if the cameras were not just lucky? Was the whole thing set up for the cameras? Years after the original moment, another layer emerged. Jaden suggested the interaction may have been encouraged or set up for content. That possibility changes everything. Not because it proves every word was scripted, it does not, but because it fits perfectly with the environment surrounding the Newman family at the time. Hello Newmans was built around turning their basketball life into entertainment. Cameras were already there, family interactions became episodes, tournaments offered endless opportunities for storylines, and reality-style content often operates in a gray area between spontaneous life and manufactured situations. A producer does not necessarily script every sentence. Sometimes all they have to do is create the situation, go talk to them, ask the question, see what happens. If that is what occurred here, then the setup may have been manufactured while the responses remain genuine. That possibility makes the clip even more interesting. Jaden may have known she was creating a content moment. LaMelo may or may not have known. Julian may have experienced real irritation despite the production context. And Jamie's reaction could still reflect genuine family brand thinking, even inside a show designed to generate entertaining footage. That creates two stories at the same time. The first story is what viewers saw. Jaden asks LaMelo for a follow. LaMelo gives her a hilarious excuse. Julian gets annoyed. The second story is what may have been happening behind the camera. A family production sees an opportunity. The cameras are placed. A conversation is encouraged. Then LaMelo delivers something nobody could have scripted better. That distinction matters because great reality content often works exactly like that. The production creates the conditions. The people create the moment. And if LaMelo truly improvised, I don't run it without knowing what was coming, then the most famous line in the entire segment may have been the least scripted part. Either way, the result escaped the show. The clip moved beyond the episode. It entered social media, then it became a meme. And once the internet took control of it, nobody in either family could ever fully bury the moment again. How one awkward moment became an immortal meme. Most viral moments die quickly. A clip explodes for a week, people quote it. Then another clip replaces it. That did not happen here. I Don't Run It survived. Years passed. The teenagers grew up. The tournaments ended. The youth basketball internet moved on. And people still remember the line. That longevity tells you the moment had become something bigger than its original context. Fans repeated it at public appearances. Jaden heard strangers bring it up years later. Julian continued being reminded of the story. The phrase appeared in comment sections and joke formats completely disconnected from basketball. At that point, it was no longer only LaMelo's response. It belonged to internet culture. Part of the staying power came from the rival. Once people learned Julian had been upset about Jaden interacting with LaMelo, every replay gained another layer. You were not simply watching a girl ask for a follow. You were watching a tiny moment that represented years of comparison between two basketball families. Part of the staying power came from Jamie's reaction. Fraternizing with the enemy gave viewers another quote to attach to the same story. And part of it came from Jaden eventually appearing willing to laugh about the whole thing. Once the people inside a meme acknowledge it, the meme often becomes permanent. But there is also something deeper. The clip captured a period of basketball culture that no longer exists in exactly the same form. LaMelo and Julian were teenage celebrities before they were adults. Their families were building brands in real time. Millions of strangers were watching youth basketball like episodic entertainment. Every interaction could become content. Every comparison could become a rival. Every sentence could become a meme. And this sentence did. What started as an Instagram follow request became one of those rare pieces of internet basketball history that outlived the original rivalry. Years later, the players had taken completely different paths. The families had changed, the audience had grown older, but the joke remained intact. And that sets up the final question. When everyone involved grew up and the rivalry stopped mattering, what did this tiny viral moment actually reveal about fame? Family pressure, branding, and the strange way the internet remembers people. What this viral moment really says about fame, family, and the internet. Years later, the funniest part of the LaMelo Ball, Jaden Newman clip is not that LaMelo gave a smooth excuse. It is that something so small ended up lasting longer than the rivalry that created it. The tournament ended, the cameras moved on, the families changed, the kids grew up, but the line survived. That is what makes this story bigger than one Instagram follow. At the time, LaMelo Ball and Julian Newman were teenagers living inside a very unusual world. Their basketball careers were being followed by millions of people before either of them had fully become an adult. Every game could become a debate. Every highlight could become evidence. Every family interaction could become content. That kind of attention can distort reality. A comparison becomes a rivalry. A rivalry becomes a brand identity. A simple conversation becomes fraternizing with the enemy. And an awkward social media question becomes basketball internet history. The biggest strategic lesson is about branding. Both the Ball family and the Newman family understood that basketball talent alone was not the entire product. Attention mattered. Storylines mattered. Personality mattered. The camera could turn an ordinary tournament weekend into something people remembered for years. But there is also a warning hidden inside that success, when young athletes become content too early, ordinary teenage moments stop belonging only to them. Millions of strangers can replay them, reinterpret them, turn them into jokes, and carry those jokes forward long after the people involved have moved on. That is exactly what happened here. The documented interaction in the source is much simpler than the romantic version. The internet sometimes attached to it. Jaden asked LaMelo for a follow. LaMelo gave her a strange but perfectly delivered excuse. Julian reacted through the rivalry he had already internalized. Jamie Newman treated the moment like a family brand violation, and the possibility that the interaction was encouraged for content added one more layer without proving that every reaction was scripted. That distinction matters. Not every viral narrative deserves to become someone's permanent identity. Jaden was more than the girl in that clip. Julian was more than LaMelo's internet comparison. And LaMelo's career became much bigger than 4 funny words. Still, the line survived because it captured something universal. Sometimes people do not want to say no directly. Sometimes they improvise. Sometimes the excuse is so perfectly ridiculous that everybody understands exactly what happened without anybody needing to explain it. That is why I don't run it. Escaped basketball, it became a social strategy, a joke, a memory, and ultimately, a reminder that internet fame is unpredictable. You can spend years building highlights, brands, and storylines. And the moment people remember most might be the sentence, "Nobody planned." The best lesson for young athletes is simple. Compete hard, build your identity carefully, but do not let internet comparisons convince you that another player has to become your enemy. Rivalries can create attention, but respect lasts longer than manufactured conflict. If you think LaMelo created that excuse completely on the spot, come on. If you think he already had a line like that ready for awkward situations, come on, dude. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe, like, share, and join the conversation below for more NBA story, player drama, forgotten rivalries, and the moments behind basketball's biggest headlines